A young woman, left to die in the freezing mountains of Colorado, thought no one would come. But when a silent figure on horseback appears through the snowstorm, everything changes. Who is he, and why did he save her life when no one else would? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked this story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The harsh winter wind whipped across the Colorado mountains, carrying with it a biting cold that seemed to cut straight through to the bone. Eleanor Mills pulled her wool coat tighter around her slender frame, but it did little to shield her from the unforgiving elements. Her journey west had begun with such hoped dreams of a new beginning, a teaching position in a frontier town, and perhaps even finding a husband someday. Now those dreams seemed as distant as the warm cabin she'd left behind 3 days ago. Just a little farther, she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. There must be shelter ahead. The stagecoach had left her at the last outpost, with promises that another would come to carry her the rest of the way to Silver Creek. But 3 days had passed, and no stagecoach had appeared. With dwindling supplies and growing desperation, Eleanor had made the fateful decision to continue on foot. Now, as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks, she realized her terrible mistake. The mountain path had become increasingly treacherous, with snow piling higher with each step. Her leather boots, suitable for Boston's cobblestone streets, but wholly inadequate for this wilderness, were soaked through. She could no longer feel her toes. "Hello?" she called out, her voice immediately swallowed by the vastness around her. "Is anyone there?" Only the howling wind answered. Eleanor stumbled, her legs heavy with exhaustion. As she fell to her knees in the snow, tears froze on her cheeks. She was 22 years old, and this desolate mountainside would be her final resting place. "I'm sorry, Father," she whispered, thinking of the man who had warned her against this Western folly. "You were right." The darkness began to close in around her vision. Eleanor's eyelids grew heavy, and she knew from her reading that this sleepiness was death's quiet approach. Just as her eyes began to close, something moved in her peripheral vision that at first she thought it was merely her imagination, a trick of the fading light. But then she saw him clearly, a tall figure on horseback, silhouetted against the darkening sky. A man with long raven black hair that whipped in the wind, sitting proud and straight on his mount. "Help," she tried to call, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. The figure approached soundlessly, his horse's hooves making no noise in the deep snow. As he drew closer, Eleanor could make out his features: high cheekbones, copper skin, and eyes dark as obsidian that seemed to look straight through her. He wore buckskin clothing adorned with intricate beadwork, and a single eagle feather was tied into his long hair. He was Comanche. The realization sent a jolt of fear through Eleanor. The stories she'd heard in Boston about the savage Indians flooded her mind, tales of scalping and torture that proper ladies whispered about over tea. The warrior dismounted in one fluid motion and approached her. Eleanor tried to scramble backward, but her limbs refused to cooperate. He knelt beside her, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't hurt me." He said nothing as he placed her on his horse, then mounted behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and despite herself, Eleanor felt the first warmth she had experienced in hours from his body pressed against her back. They rode in silence through the gathering darkness, the warrior guiding his horse with expert precision along paths invisible to Eleanor's eyes. After what seemed like hours, they arrived at a small cave tucked into the mountainside. The Comanche warrior gently lifted Eleanor from the horse and carried her inside. The cave was simple but prepared for habitation, with dry firewood stacked neatly against one wall. He laid her down on a bed of furs and immediately set about building a fire. Eleanor watched him through half-frozen lashes, her mind struggling to reconcile her fear with his gentle actions. As the flames caught and grew, casting a warm orange glow throughout the small space, the warrior turned to her and began to remove her wet boots. "No," she protested weakly, trying to pull away. He paused, meeting her eyes, then deliberately picked up one of her feet. Her toes were white with frostbite. With efficient movements, he continued removing her soaked footwear, then wrapped her feet in dry furs. "Thank you," Eleanor whispered, shame washing over her for assuming the worst. The warrior nodded once, but remained silent. He moved to the cave entrance, brought in his saddlebags, and retrieved some dried meat. He offered some to Eleanor, who accepted it gratefully. As warmth slowly returned to her body, Eleanor studied her savior more carefully. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s. A scar ran from his temple to his jaw on the right side of his face, and his hands, though strong, showed signs of old injuries. "My name is Eleanor Mills," she said softly, touching her chest. "Eleanor." The warrior watched her for a long moment, then touched his own chest. "Tashunka." It was the first word he had spoken, and his deep voice resonated in the small cave. Eleanor repeated his name, trying to get the pronunciation right, and was rewarded with the faintest hint of a smile. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but within the cave, beside the crackling fire, Eleanor felt something unexpected begin to blossom: hope. Dawn broke over the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Eleanor awoke to find Tashunka already up, tending to his horse outside the cave. Her body ached from the previous day's ordeal, but she was alive, a miracle. She owed entirely to the silent warrior. She sat up slowly, testing her limbs. Her feet were painful, but no longer numb, which she knew was a good sign. The furs Tashunka had wrapped around them had saved her from losing toes to frostbite. When he returned to the cave, Eleanor offered him a tentative smile. "Thank you for saving my life," she said, aware that he might not understand her words but hoping he would comprehend her gratitude. Tashunka nodded, then surprised her by responding in halting English. "Storm. Finish soon. We go. When safe." "You speak English," Eleanor exclaimed, relief washing over her. "Little words," he replied, holding his thumb and forefinger close together to indicate the limited extent of his vocabulary. "Where did you learn?" she asked, curious about this man who had shattered all her preconceptions in the span of a single night. Tashunka's expression darkened slightly. "White man school. Long time ago." Eleanor wanted to ask more questions, but she sensed his reluctance to elaborate. Instead, she asked, "Where will we go?" "Silver Creek," he replied, surprising her again. "You go there. I see tracks in snow before storm." Eleanor nodded, touched that he had deduced her destination. "Yes, I'm to be the new schoolteacher there. The stagecoach never came, so I tried to walk." She laughed ruefully. "Not my wisest decision." Tashunka's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, perhaps understanding, perhaps amusement at her folly. He moved to the cave entrance and studied the sky. "We wait. One day more." Eleanor used the time to learn more about her rescuer, though extracting information from him was like coaxing water from stone. Through persistent questioning and patient waiting, she discovered that Tashunka lived alone, separated from his tribe for reasons he would not disclose. He trapped and traded with both settlers and other native tribes, moving between different territories with the seasons. "Aren't you lonely?" she asked that evening as they shared a meal of rabbit he had snared. Tashunka was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. Finally he said, "Man alone hears his own thoughts. But what about family, friends?" She pressed, unable to imagine a life of such solitude. Again, that shadow passed over his features. "Gone." The single word held such weight that Eleanor did not dare ask more. Instead, she told him about her own life, her father's stern disapproval of her decision to travel west, her mother's death from influenza 3 years prior, her determination to make her own way in the world rather than marry a Boston merchant, as her father had arranged. "You brave," Tashunka commented when she finished. "Foolish, but brave." Eleanor laughed, surprised by his assessment. "I suppose nearly freezing to death does qualify as foolish." The faintest smile touched his lips. Before vanishing, "Sleep now. Tomorrow we ride." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Tashunka packed his few belongings efficiently, while Eleanor struggled to make herself presentable with her limited resources. Her dress was wrinkled beyond salvation, and her hair had come loose from its pins, but there was little to be done about it. Tashunka led his horse from the cave and helped Eleanor mount. The animal, a sturdy pinto with intelligent eyes, seemed unbothered by the additional rider. Tashunka swung up behind her, and they set off down the mountain. The journey was slow, the horse picking its way carefully through deep snow. Eleanor was acutely aware of Tashunka's presence behind her, his steady breathing, the occasional directions he murmured to his horse in his native tongue, the way he instinctively steadied her when the path grew treacherous. By midday, they had descended enough that the snow was shallower, and Eleanor caught her first glimpse of Silver Creek in the valley below, a small collection of wooden buildings nestled beside a winding stream, with scattered homesteads dotting the surrounding area. "Your new home," Tashunka said, reining in the horse to allow her a moment to take in the view. "It's smaller than I imagined," Eleanor admitted, "but beautiful in its way." As they continued their descent, Eleanor noticed Tashunka growing increasingly tense. His posture stiffened, and he scanned the landscape constantly, as if expecting danger. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "White town," he replied simply. "Not welcome." Understanding dawned on Eleanor. "You're afraid they'll treat you badly because you're Comanche." Tashunka didn't respond directly. "I leave you at edge of town." "But I want them to know you saved me," Eleanor protested. "You're a hero, Tashunka." He shook his head firmly. "No hero. Just man who found woman in snow." Eleanor wanted to argue further, but the set of his jaw told her would be futile. They rode the rest of the way in silence, the distance between Silver Creek and themselves shrinking with each passing minute. When they reached the outskirts of town, Tashunka stopped his horse beneath the shelter of a large cottonwood tree. "You go now." Eleanor turned awkwardly in the saddle to face him. "How can I ever thank you?" "Live," he said simply. "Teach children well." Impulsively, Eleanor reached up and touched his scarred cheek. "I'll never forget you, Tashunka." Something flickered in his dark eyes, an emotion she couldn't name before. He carefully lifted her from the horse and set her on her feet. Without another word, he turned his mount and rode away, leaving Eleanor standing alone at the edge of her new life, watching his figure grow smaller against the vast landscape. With a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and turned toward Silver Creek. She had barely taken 3 steps when she heard shouting in the distance. Looking up, she saw 3 men on horseback galloping toward her from town. "Miss," Lynn called out. "Are you Miss Mills, the new school teacher?" "Yes," she replied, raising a hand in greeting. "I'm Eleanor Mills." The men reached her quickly, dismounting in a flurry of concern. "We've been searching for days," explained the oldest of the 3, a gray-haired man with kind eyes. "When you didn't arrive on the stagecoach, we feared the worst." "I nearly met the worst," Eleanor admitted. "If not for," she turned to point toward Tashunka, but he had already disappeared over the ridge, as silent in his departure as he had been in his arrival. 3 months had passed since Eleanor's arrival in Silver Creek, and winter had begun to loosen its grip on the mountain town. The first tentative shoots of green were appearing in the meadows, and the creek that gave the settlement its name flowed faster with melting snow from the heights. Eleanor had settled into her role as the town schoolteacher. earning the respect of the community with her dedication and the affection of her pupils, with her kind but firm teaching style. The schoolhouse, a simple one-room building with rough-hewn benches and a pot-bellied stove, had become her second home. Yet despite her successful integration into Silver Creek society, Eleanor's thoughts often strayed to Tashunka. On clear days, she would find herself gazing toward the mountains, wondering where he might be and if he was safe. She had tried to tell the townspeople about his heroism, but her words had been met with skepticism and, in some cases, outright hostility. "Comanche ain't known for their charity, Miss Mills," Sheriff Douglas had told her when she first recounted her rescue. More likely he had other intentions that got interrupted. Eleanor had been indignant at the suggestion. "He saved my life. Sheriff, he could have left me to die, or worse, if his intentions were dishonorable. Instead, he brought me safely to town and asked for nothing in return." But the sheriff and others remained unconvinced, and eventually, Eleanor stopped mentioning Tashunka. She kept his memory private, a secret warmth she carried within. On this particular morning, Eleanor was writing arithmetic problems on the blackboard when the schoolhouse door burst open. 10-year-old Billy Carter stood in the doorway, his freckled face flushed with excitement. Miss Mills, there's a Comanche at Harper's trading post." Eleanor's chalk froze mid-stroke, her heart suddenly pounding. "A Comanche? Yes'm. Poe says he's trading furs, but some of the men are getting riled up about it. Sheriff Douglas is headed over there now." Eleanor set down the chalk with deliberate calmness, though her hands trembled slightly. "Children, please continue with your reading lesson. Mary, you're in charge until I return." Ignoring the whispers that erupted behind her, Eleanor hurried from the schoolhouse toward the trading post. At the center of town, a small crowd had gathered outside, mostly men with stern expressions and crossed arms. Through the shop window, she could see Mr. Harper examining what appeared to be beaver pelts, while across the counter stood a familiar figure in buckskin. Clothing.tshunka. Eleanor pushed her way through the crowd just as Sheriff Douglas arrived, his hand resting meaningfully on the revolver at his hip. "What's the trouble here, Harper?" the sheriff called as he entered the store. "No trouble, Sheriff," replied the trader, a thin man with spectacles and a practical nature. "Just doing business. These are prime pelts, worth good money." Tashunka stood still, his face impassive, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders. His eyes flickered briefly to her as she entered, betraying a flash of recognition before returning to their careful neutrality. "We don't want his kind in town," growled one of the men who had followed the sheriff inside. Thomas Blackwood was one of Silver Creek's most prosperous ranchers, and also one of its most outspoken voices against the native tribes. "Comanche killed my brother in '53. This man hasn't killed anyone," Eleanor interjected, stepping forward. "In fact, he saved my life during the blizzard in January. I wouldn't be here teaching your children if not for him." A murmur ran through the crowd. Sheriff Douglas frowned. "Miss Mills, I thought we'd settled this matter. Your recollection of events was likely confused by your ordeal." "I was not confused, Sheriff," Eleanor replied firmly. "This is the man who found me half frozen in the mountains and brought me safely to Silver Creek. His name is Tashunka." All eyes turned to the Comanche warrior, who remained silent, his gaze fixed on the transaction before him. "That true, Indian?" demanded Blackwood. "You the one who found our school marm?" Tashunka finally spoke, his deep voice quiet but clear. "Yes. Why?" pressed the sheriff, suspicion evident in his tone. Tashunka met his gaze steadily. "She would die. No one deserves to die alone in cold." The simple dignity of his words created a momentary silence. Mr. Harper cleared his throat awkwardly and pushed a small pile of coins across the counter. "Your pelts are worth $15, sir. Fair price." Tashunka nodded once and collected the money, tucking it into a small pouch at his waist. Then, without another word, He turned to leave. "Wait," Eleanor said, stepping closer. "Tashunka, thank you again for saving me. I've wanted to properly express my gratitude." He paused, studying her face. "No need for thanks. You live. That is enough." "Let me at least offer you a meal before you go," she persisted. "It's nearly noon, and the boarding house serves an excellent stew." Sheriff Douglas frowned. "Miss Mills, that wouldn't be appropriate. I don't recall asking for your permission." "Sheriff," Eleanor interrupted, a steely note entering her voice. "This man saved my life. The least I can do is offer him a meal in return." Tashunka shook his head slightly. "No need. I go now." Eleanor understood his reluctance. The hostility in the room was palpable, but she was determined. "Please. Just one meal." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the eyes that only she seemed to notice. After a long moment, he nodded once. The meal at the boarding house was a tense affair. Mrs. Holloway, the proprietress, had nearly refused to serve them until Eleanor reminded her sharply that she paid good money for her board and could invite a guest if she wished. They sat at a small table in the corner, acutely aware of the stares from the other diners. "I'm sorry about their behavior," Eleanor said quietly as Tashunka ate with careful, deliberate movements. "They don't understand." "They understand," he replied. "They fear what is different. Have you been well?" she asked, eager to change the subject. "Where have you been living?" "Mountains," he said, gesturing vaguely westward. "Many places follow game. Alone?" She couldn't help asking. His eyes met hers. "Yes, alone is safer. For you, perhaps." "But I nearly died alone," Eleanor said. "Sometimes we need others, whether we wish to admit it or not." Tashunka considered her words, then replied in his most extended speech yet. "My people say man is like tree. Can stand alone, but forest survives when trees grow together." "That's beautiful," Eleanor said, genuinely moved. "And wise. Your people have much to teach. If others would only listen." "Few listen," he said simply, returning to his stew. When they had finished eating, Eleanor walked with Tashunka to the edge of town where his horse was tethered. The animal nickered softly in greeting as its master approached. "Will you come too?" "Silver Creek again?" Eleanor asked, surprised by how much she hoped the answer would be yes. Tashunka hesitated, then nodded. "When I have furs to trade." "Good," she said, smiling. "Perhaps next time you'll tell me more about your people's wisdom. I would like to share it with my students." "Your people will not approve," he warned. "Then they will have to learn to disapprove." More quietly, she replied with determination. "Safe travels, Tashunka." As he mounted his horse, Eleanor impulsively reached out to touch his hand. "You are always welcome where I am." His fingers briefly curled around hers, a gesture so quick she might have imagined it. Then he was riding away, a solitary figure against the vast wilderness that had nearly claimed her life and instead had brought her an unexpected friendship that defied the boundaries between their worlds. From the boarding house window, Thomas Blackwood watched the schoolteacher and the Comanche warrior with narrowed eyes, his mind churning with dark thoughts and old hatreds that would not stay buried. Spring had fully arrived in Silver Creek, bringing with it wildflowers that carpeted the meadows and longer, warmer days that allowed Eleanor to take her students outside for nature lessons. Her popularity in the community had continued to grow, though some still whispered about her unnatural defense of the fence of the Comanche man who occasionally appeared at Harper's trading post. Tashunka had returned to Silver Creek 3 times since that tense day in the trading post. Each visit followed the same pattern. He would arrive early in the morning, conduct his business quickly, and then meet Eleanor briefly before departing. Their encounters were short but meaningful, Eleanor gradually learning more about his solitary life and the culture he had been separated from. During his last visit, 2 weeks prior, he had brought her a small gift, a delicately carved wooden fox. "To remember wisdom," he had explained. Fox knows when to hide, when to run, when to stand ground. Eleanor kept the carving on her desk at the schoolhouse, much to the fascination of her students, who peppered her with questions about her Indian friend. She answered honestly but carefully, aware of the complicated feelings many in the community harbored toward the native tribes. On this particular afternoon, Eleanor was walking back to the boarding house after school when Sheriff Douglas approached her, his expression grave. "Miss Mills, might I have a word?" "Of course, Sheriff," she replied, pausing on the wooden sidewalk. "It's about your association with that Comanche," he said, lowering his voice. "It's causing talk in town." Eleanor straightened her spine. "I wasn't aware that my friendships were subject to town approval, Sheriff." "They ain't, ordinarily," he admitted, shifting uncomfortably. "But this is different. Blackwood's been stirring up trouble, saying it ain't proper for the schoolteacher to be consorting with savages." "Mr. Tashunka is not a savage," Eleanor replied firmly, "and consorting implies something entirely inappropriate. We are merely acquaintances." The sheriff sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his graying hair. "Look, Miss Mills, I'm just trying to warn you. Blackwood lost family to Comanche raids. He's got a deep hatred, and he's influential in these parts. Are you suggesting I should abandon a friendship because of Mr. Blackwood's prejudices?" Eleanor asked, her voice cooling. "I'm suggesting you be careful," the sheriff replied. "For your own sake, and for the Indians too. Not everyone in Silver Creek is as open-minded as you." With that warning, he replaced his hat and continued down the street, leaving Eleanor troubled. She had known her friendship with Tashunka was unusual, but she hadn't fully appreciated the danger it might represent to him more than herself. That evening, as Eleanor prepared lessons at her small desk in her boarding house room, a commotion in the street drew her to the window. A group of men on horseback was gathering outside, led by Thomas Blackwood. Several carried torches, their flames bright against the deepening twilight. Mrs. Holloway burst into her room without knocking, her round face flushed with excitement. "Miss Mills, they've spotted that Comanche in the North Valley. Blackwood says he's been stealing cattle, and they're forming a posse to catch him." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "That's ridiculous. Tashunka is a hunter and trapper, not a thief." "Well, Blackwood says 3 of his calves went missing yesterday, and one of his hands spotted an Indian watching the herd," Mrs. Holloway replied. "They're going after him now." Without pausing to think, Eleanor grabbed her shawl and rushed downstairs and out into the street. The posse was growing, with more men joining, some looking eager for violence, others merely caught up in the moment. "Mr. Blackwood," Eleanor called out, approaching the rancher's horse. "This is madness. You have no proof that Tashunka took your cattle." Blackwood looked down at her with contempt. "Stay out of this, schoolmarm. This is men's business. That Comanche's been skulking around too long, and now he's getting bold. Time to teach him a lesson, Sheriff." Eleanor appealed to Douglas, who sat uncomfortably on his horse nearby. "You can't allow this. It's nothing but a lynch mob." "We're just going to bring him in for questioning, Miss Mills," the sheriff replied, though his eyes betrayed his doubt. "If he's innocent, he has nothing to fear." "Nothing to fear?" Eleanor repeated incredulously. "Look at these men. They're armed for war, not an arrest." But her protests fell on deaf ears as Blackwood raised his voice. "Let's ride, boys. We'll catch that thieving savage before he gets back to the mountains." As the posse thundered out of town, Eleanor stood helpless in the street, dust swirling around her skirts. Then, with sudden determination, she turned and ran to the livery stable. "I need a horse, Mr. Wilson," she told the stable master, immediately. "Now, Miss Mills, you ain't thinking of following that posse, are you?" the old man asked, alarmed. "I need to prevent a grave injustice," she replied. "Please, Mr. Wilson, I can ride, and I'll pay double your usual fee." Something in her expression must have convinced him, for he nodded reluctantly and saddled a gentle mare for her. Within minutes, Eleanor was galloping north, following the posse's trail by the light of the rising moon. She knew the valley. They were headed toward Tashunka had mentioned he sometimes camped there when trading in Silver Creek. It was a sheltered spot with a small stream, hidden from the main trail by a stand of cottonwoods. Eleanor rode hard, grateful for the riding lessons her father had insisted upon in her youth. By the time she reached the valley, the posse had already arrived. Torchlight flickered among the trees, and angry voices carried on the night air. Heart pounding, she dismounted and tied her horse to a tree, then crept closer on foot. The scene that greeted her filled her with horror. Tashunka stood with his back against a large boulder, surrounded by Blackwood and his men. His hands were raised slightly, but his expression remained dignified, even as Blackwood pressed a rifle barrel to his chest. "I found the hides," one of the men called, emerging from Tashunka's small camp, holding up what appeared to be freshly cured skins. "Proof he's been rustling. Those are deer hides," Eleanor shouted, stepping into the clearing. "Not cattle." All heads turned toward her in shock. Sheriff Douglas recovered first. "Miss Mills, what in God's name are you doing here?" "Preventing a murder," she replied, moving steadily forward until she stood beside Tashunka. "These men are determined to hang an innocent man based on nothing but prejudice and hatred." "Get out of the way, woman," Blackwood growled. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns all of us," Eleanor replied, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent clearing. "What kind of community are we building if we allow mob rule to replace justice? What are we teaching our children when we condemn a man based solely on his race?" She turned to the sheriff. "Examine those hides, Sheriff Douglas. They're deer, not cattle. And even if some calves are missing, you have no evidence linking Tashunka to their disappearance." The sheriff hesitated, then took the hides from his deputy and studied them in the torchlight. "She's right," he admitted reluctantly. "These ain't cattle hides." "That don't mean he didn't take them," Blackwood insisted. "Probably sold the meat already." "I no take cattle." Tashunka spoke for the first time, his deep voice calm despite the rifle still pressed to his chest. "No need. Have plenty game." "Lair!" Blackwood spat, pushing the rifle harder against him. "That's enough." Sheriff Douglas intervened, pushing the rifle barrel down. "We came to arrest him for questioning, not execute him on the spot. And the schoolmarm's right. We don't have enough evidence." A tense standoff ensued, with Blackwood glaring at the sheriff, his finger still on the trigger. Finally, with a curse, he lowered his weapon. "Fine, take him in for questioning. But if my calves don't turn up, I'll know who to blame." As two deputies moved to take Tashunka's arms, Eleanor stepped between them. "No, he comes with me. I'll bring him to town tomorrow, and he can answer your questions then." "That's not how the law works, Miss Mills," the sheriff began. "Neither is this midnight raid," she countered. "You've seen his camp. There's no evidence of cattle rustling. Let him collect his belongings, and I give you my word he'll come to town tomorrow." Perhaps it was the unusual authority in the schoolteacher's voice, or perhaps it was the sheriff's own discomfort with the situation, but after a long moment, Douglas nodded. "All right. But I expect to see both of you in my office at noon tomorrow." As the posse reluctantly dispersed, Blackwood lingered, his face twisted with anger. "This ain't over," he warned before finally riding away. When they were alone, Eleanor's composure finally cracked. She sank onto a fallen log, trembling with the aftermath of fear and anger. "They could have killed you." Tashunka knelt beside her, his dark eyes searching her face. "Why you come? Dangerous for you." "I couldn't let them hurt you," she replied simply. "Not when you saved me without hesitation." He was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, "You have brave heart, Eleanor Mills." It was the first time he had used her name, and something in his voice made her look up and meet his gaze. In the moonlight, with the danger past, she saw in his eyes what had been hidden before, a deep respect, and perhaps something more. "What will happen tomorrow?" he asked. "We'll go to town as promised," she replied. "The sheriff is a fair man, despite everything. And they'll likely find those missing calves in another pasture. Blackwood's ranch is vast, and his men are not always thorough." Tashunka nodded, then surprised her by saying, "I leave these mountains." "After tomorrow, leave? But why?" "Not safe now," he said simply. "Some men never forget hatred." Eleanor knew he was right. Blackwood would not forgive or forget this night. "Where will you go?" "West," he replied. "New territories. Start again." A profound sadness washed over Eleanor at the thought of never seeing him again. In the short time she had known him, this quiet, dignified man had changed her understanding of courage and humanity more than anyone she had ever met. "I wish things were different," she whispered. Tashunka reached out and, with gentle fingers, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so unexpected and tender that Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Some things change slow," he said, "like river shaping stone. Take many years, but river always wins." Eleanor smiled sadly. "I may not see that day." "You teach children," he reminded her. "They see world new because of you. That is how change comes." As they sat together under the vast sky, Eleanor realized that Tashunka had given her far more than her life during that snowstorm. He had given her a deeper understanding of courage, dignity, and the patient hope that, despite the prejudices of their time, the future might indeed be different. In the morning, they would ride to town together, a schoolteacher and a warrior, united by circumstance and separated by a world that wasn't ready for their friendship. But for that night, beneath the stars that had witnessed countless human struggles and triumphs, they shared the simple comfort of each other's presence. Two souls who had found unexpected connection across the vast divides of their different worlds.